You are listening to Salty Believer Unscripted, a conversation on Christian ministry and the Christian life.
This is Salty Believer Unscripted. I'm Josiah Walker.
And I'm Bryan Catherman.
And on today's episode, we just wanted to share with everyone that Bryan is leaving.
Well, yeah, after we sort of let the cat out of the bag on the other episode.
But not leaving the podcast.
Nope.
But is leaving the church that you and I pastor together as co-elders here.
Anybody who's been listening to this podcast since its inception, at the time of this recording was over 13 years ago, knows this podcast goes through seasons.
Sure. For instance, we're in a season now, like when this episode comes out, you will have been already at your new post.
Yep.
There in Holdrege, Nebraska, at Trinity Church.
And you'll be leading as the lead
pastor here at Redeeming Life Church.
Installation service is coming up this Sunday at the time of this recording. By the time this comes out, that'll be out for a bit. The magic of the podcast is lost.
Sure.
But
there's some time differences there. But in this moment, during this podcast recording, here we are. We're sitting in your office.
No, this is an empty office. I've already packed all my stuff.
All your books are gone.
Your office.
I wish you had left the books, but everything's gone. So we're sitting in this empty room, and it's becoming real that you're leaving and you're transitioning out.
Yeah.
And so I want to just kind of talk about that, unscripted, of course. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling excited.
Okay.
And that's we use that word so flippantly.
Sure.
That, I'm excited about this and excited about that. But there's some anticipation and some kind of joy and maybe a little nervousness about the task that's ahead.
For sure.
I mean, I've been pastoring Redeeming Life for 10 years, and the people are really accustomed to how we preach and what my convictions are and where we're going. And I'm coming into this other role. I won't even be the lead pastor for a while.
Sure.
If ever.
Right.
I mean, God could do who knows what God's going to do.
That's the other thing. So you're going from a lead pastor role to more of an associate pastor or maybe like a teaching pastor?
I'll be the teaching pastor. I'll be the pastor of teaching and discipleship.
Okay.
I'm coming in with a pastor I've worked with before who's been on this podcast, Kevin Lund. And he's at the point where he's at some point in the near future will be retiring. Yeah. And so he really went out to help get this church really staffed, to build the team there, to get it situated for its future. Right. Because in the past, they've had pastors there for 15, 20 years. And so I really hope that I can do that and retire there.
So that adds a whole nother dynamic. So it's one thing when we kind of start a new job, right? And maybe we leave a job or a position or a situation where everything's kind of set up the way we like it. We're comfortable, where things are going the way we want it. And then having to go somewhere and just kind of start fresh. But not only are you going somewhere else where you're having to kind of start and maybe fit yourself into a spot that's doing things differently than you're accustomed to doing.
Right, yep.
But here you are, you're joining in ministry again with someone who's previously served as your boss.
Yep.
Right? At a time where you had never been a lead pastor. That was kind of your first ministry post?
Not then.
Or so early on.
So this Pastor Kevin Lund, he and I have had quite a few conversations over the last couple of months because he's been asking me to come, and I've been like, I don't know. And then finally God sort of just unlocked the pieces. I'm like, I actually am doing this. But that's been one of the major points is how do we humble ourselves, both of us? How do we humble ourselves to serve the King more than we serve our own egos or our own agendas or our own
both
needs?
have been serving as lead pastors. Now you're going to go and kind of serve under him again. But you're a different person, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Now.
And so is he.
You have your doctorate now.
And so is he. Well, and we've been on the phone a little bit as I'm getting ready to go, and he says I'm really looking forward to getting another set of senior pastor eyes in here to really look at these. Like, we have a staff that looks great, but none of that staff that I'm aware of has ever served as a senior pastor.
Sure.
So there's just something different, and you'll learn as you become a senior pastor. Right. Jared's been on the podcast for a long time, and he's a senior pastor, and so you see things just a little differently when the buck stops with you in that way.
For sure. And already I laugh because you raised me up. You helped me grow. I started as a kids ministry intern, and you grew me into becoming a minister and a pastor and an elder here. And even that first kind of year as co-elders, I still felt like, okay, well, you know more than me, so I'll defer to your leadership. But here you and Kevin, that's going to be a different dynamic where you both are very educated, where you've served in these roles for a while.
If we can be mature about it, it'll be very good for the church there, and I think very good for the kingdom. Where things have the potential for going sideways, which is true in any church, in any circumstance, is when sin gets involved. Right. So if we can be mature about it, if we can if we can let the Lord mortify our sin and serve Him, we could be less, He could be more. I think really positive things can come from this dynamic, and I don't know what God's timing will be, and I don't know if that church is going to be as receptive to me. I might not end up being the lead pastor, which I suppose if that's what God has in store, then I'm going to have to be mature about that as well.
For sure. So there's a lot of unknown there. There's some exciting things, some trepidatious things, but that might not even be the most intimidating change, because here you are, you're also going from a church. Our church attendance averages in the 90s. This was a church that you planted, that started with just a handful of families,
right? And
now you're going to a church of what, 500, 600, 700 people?
Yep. And I'm not even 100% sure. On a Sunday they'll have 600, 650, somewhere in there, but I'm not even sure how many people in this little community, because it's also a small town, call that their church home, even if they show up once a month. I don't know. I have a lot to learn.
So that, in itself is a huge shift of going from a small church in a big community where you can kind of be a stranger in the grocery store to a big church in a small town where everyone's going to know you. You've told stories of going to visit there, and stuck
people
out
are already like, "Hey, you're here in town today." So I think part of that is it's a learning opportunity for me in this service, in that, when Paul says, "Follow me as I follow Christ," or follow the example that's been put before you by the apostles or the elders or the people who, there's a few places in Scripture where Paul really makes that clear. Follow these examples, live, learn. It's a lot easier when we live in a place where our example isn't observed very closely.
Right.
You can't hide in a place like this.
Sure.
Which I really am welcoming that. I'm really looking forward to living in a community in that way with other brothers and sisters in Christ, and even before maybe a lost community of people as well. But it really, I think, will force that growth and that sanctification in me. Not saying I totally live a double life or anything, but I have a lot to learn in this area of, it's not just while I'm here at the building and maybe a little bit while I'm in the community, but right now I don't go to Walmart and expect, other than a Sunday afternoon, to run into anybody that we just got done pastoring, because you're sort of on your own. So you're just doing your thing. Sure. But what's going to happen is, and I'm not the most open to quick and impromptu chit-chat, I'm going to run into people. Hey, how are you doing with this? And how about that? And how's it going? I heard so-and-so had the surgery this week. That stuff, when you're not thinking about it, sometimes doesn't jump to the forefront of your mind. But now I'm going to have to be keeping the well-being and the welfare of God's people on the forefront of my mind all the time.
Well, and it's funny because I never run into somebody that I really know at the grocery store. If I do, both of us are trying to figure out if we know that person. So the other day we were in the car and I spilled the drink all over myself, and I went in the store and Maddie's like, "You should stay in the car. My daughter, you look like you just got
you look like a hobo."
Yeah, and I was like, "Well, I'm not going to see anybody I know, so whatever." But here you're going to be constantly seen and approached by people.
Yeah, if you spill mustard on your shirt from a hot dog, everyone's going to know.
That's mustard guy. But that's not the only change either, because sure, here at this church, we've got a small staff, 2 or 3 people, but you're going to a staff now of 10, 12 people, is it?
I am thrilled about the opportunities that this affords, and I'm also feeling like, okay, this is going to be an interesting dynamic. I've served on a church with about 9 people, I think, on the staff, interns and a variety of people. So I've served in that environment. But when I was doing that, that was early on in my ministry.
Yeah.
My role in that capacity was not to help train up and equip and disciple. And so in the 10 years that I've been working...
the low guy on the totem pole.
Yeah. In the 10 years that we've been planting and working, we've worked with numerous staff members, and I've had the real privilege and joy of walking with them, helping them to grow and learn. But it's never been a bunch of people at the same time.
We've had an intern here and there, but it's always one at a time.
It's always one at a time. And now we have 2 of you guys on the staff here, and I've been able to continue to sort of pour into and equip. And then also we're all sanctified together in a smaller environment. So that will be a pretty big change, because with you and I and even Robbie here, it's more interconnectivity all the time, because there's 3 of us.
Yeah.
There's not going to be that kind of interconnectivity when there's a much larger group. So I'm looking forward to what God might teach me in that, and how I might be able to bless those individuals with things that He's grown me in and stuff I've learned through my education. And you know what? That's a bigger group to help me be sanctified, to help show me some of my own blind spots.
Yeah.
It's a lot of vanity. So I'm looking forward to what that's going to look like, but there's a sense of that's going to be different. and I don't know what I'm getting into.
So, with all these changes, was there ever a point in this process where you're like, I don't know if I want to do this. I'm comfortable. I like where I am.
That was the point the whole time. So, like months ago.
Or were you just up for an adventure and like, no, I want to change?
No. Months ago, when Kevin first approached me, almost just jokingly, he said, hey, I'm going out here and I'm looking. His job was to look for these personnel to do this work. And he said, man, you ought to come out here. And I thought, well, that's great. I'm flattered. But it was kind of what you just said. Well, I'm comfortable, and God's got me here, and I love this church, and I love their passion for the Word, and I love the convictions we've formulated together as a church over the last decade. And man, this is awesome, and I love the team I work with. And there's right, and I'm comfortable. And then just over like a series of 3 months, and it grew and grew and grew. Like I think God might be calling here. But man, right towards the end, all the things got stacked together, and I realized it's not about me being comfortable.
Sure.
And it's not about what I know, and it's not about any of this. It's about following God. I mean, you think about Abraham, go. I don't know where. Just go for it. I'm not going to give you all the details. Here we go. And so I felt like there was a little bit of that feeling, and it's just trust the Lord as He builds His church. He's going to. I mean, it could be a learning experience of me of epic proportions and a complete disaster. It could be just an amazing outpouring of what God's doing, or it could be a long, slow slog and persevering, but I know that God has what's best for me, even if I don't know if it's best for me.
For sure.
Right? So I'm trusting in that, but it wasn't until the last few weeks in the process when I went, wait a minute, God really is calling this. The first few weeks were like, ha ha ha, isn't that cute? But man, not now.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to break free of some of that comfort, which is a good lesson for all of us. Right. We should all be trying to break free at times from you don't want to sit too comfortable when you're doing kingdom work.
Right.
You kind of want to be dependent on Jesus and a little bit uncomfortable as you're being sanctified and grown.
And I remember being in the grocery business, I was always excited for those new stores and new challenges and different things like that because I love changing things. But it's a little different in ministry. You can't just go in and overhaul everything and make it the way you want it to be in 2 weeks.
No, you can't. So here's the thing. No faithful pastor who's trusting in Christ to build his church can make anything like he wants it.
Right.
He's got to follow suit with John the Baptist. I must be less, Christ must be more. Christ builds his church. So what the pastor is supposed to be doing is saying, what is it that God has for this church? And there should be other people involved in, like, is this God's will for the church? Sometimes it's congregationally led. Sometimes it's elders gathering together. Whatever that might be. What is it that God has for this church? And then it's the pastor's job not to shoot after his own preferences, but to shoot after God's will for the church. And when that happens, and the whole church is able to come into that together, then great things will happen for that church, whatever they might be. I'm not talking about like it's just going to grow and have tons of numbers, but it's going to glorify God and do whatever God has called that church to be doing. And so when I go into this situation, I can look and go, oh, well, that would be interesting if they did this, or I don't know why they do that, or boy, I sure wish they'd changed the coffee creamer flavor, or whatever. Just I guess the coffee creamer of just black coffee, because black coffee is the best. But that's not the job.
Right.
The job is to go, what does God have for this church? And it was really encouraging to talk with the elders of that church, to talk with some of the staff members of that church, to talk with some of the people of that church, and hear some common themes and go, it seems like God is leading them. They're really pressing into this concept of being more missional, but given their circumstances, more like an equipping center, a base camp. They're going to fill the backpacks of the people they're sending out on mission, metaphorically. And I thought, well, okay, if that seems like that's what God's doing. And so as I go in, it's not so much looking at like the little ticky-tacky things you change. It's what does God have this church to be and how will we grow? And that's really exciting. Very different than a grocery store.
Well, for sure, too, because not only that...
And that's what you have to do, by the way.
Right. Well, and in the grocery business, I watched as, like, owners would retire or die and give it off to their sons or their children and hope it succeeded. That's a little different in churches, too, because how has, in this process of leaving the church that you planted, that you started, how has that felt a little different knowing that Christ builds his church and he's the one that you're working for ultimately?
There's some ideas once in a while of things like, well, there's a new sheriff in town or under new management. The church is never under new management.
Right.
Ever. There's never a mattress sale where new ownership and there's none of that. There's never a new sheriff in town. Never. Unless you have an unbiblical understanding of what the church is. Jesus is always the head of the church. And so all we're doing is coming along with that, which is really encouraging as I leave here after being a part of that for 10 years. I can confidently say, well, Jesus is still leading and growing his church exactly as he has.
Right.
And the next person who comes in, if he holds on to Christ and abides in Christ and walks with Christ, then whatever is supposed to be happening here will happen, and it doesn't have to be sort of that weird, now we're going to have a big lurching change on all things. Because there isn't a new manager. Yeah. Right? And so I take great comfort in leaving here in that idea and going there in that idea. And going, okay, we're still working on the same, whatever Jesus is doing. Now, there are times when a church might get off, and I hope it's in either of these two churches we're going to, where sometimes you have to bring somebody in, you have to, that person has to bring some really hard things. Like, you guys have actually maybe gotten into some sinful thinking here.
Lost your way.
And you've lost your way, and you're not trusting in Jesus, or you're holding on to tradition in a bad way, or you're holding on to whatever, and you have to be that person because Jesus makes it abundantly clear to bring in some of those things. I hope that's not the case for either one of us. Right. Like I really hope that's not the situation.
For me, it's rather easy. I just want to keep doing what we've been doing and hopefully not screw things up too bad. But imagine...
I think it's hopefully going to be the same way where I'm going, because I've met the elders and I met the staff, and I think they're all really seeking to love Jesus, and they recognize these are the areas we have to work on. And we know at Redeeming Life, these are the areas we need to Jesus has made it clear we got to keep growing in these areas. So it's not like it's anything crazy. Right. So I think that's pretty exciting.
And as exciting as it is, and as much as you're anticipating those changes, I got to imagine it's a little bittersweet too, even just sitting here in your empty office and kind of leaving your friends and the community that you've built your life around.
It's a difficult, really sanctifying process.
Sure.
I feel like, I'm being challenged to be mature and grow in watching, this was never my labor and toil. Yeah. This was always God's work. I just got to be a part. There are things I really, really love. Like this office I've been working in here for not a long time because of the merge and things, but it's this place that has significant meaning. The friends and the people that I've watched people go from being unbelieving, mean, cantankerous, sinful people who protected and defended their sin, to being saved, redeemed, sinful people who are now trying to mortify their sin and grow in their sin and hold on to Christ and glorify God. And you just love seeing that in their lives. I've married people, we've buried people, we're watching their spouses after we've done funerals, we're watching kids grow up. That is really hard to say, okay, this all goes on beyond us, but that's the case even when we die. So if Jesus should move us somewhere else, we have to be faithful to that, and it is hard.
It is. And I remember, you mentioned that this whole process started with Kevin making a joke with you about leaving. And it was kind of funny because even here we would joke about it, because as we've had conversations over the years of doing ministry together, we've always talked about maybe planting another church, or as I was raised up, sending me out. Mm-hmm. And the thought was never that you would go as the lead pastor.
I'm a little embarrassed that I never really put that in my mind.
That had to be difficult because I can't think of, it's not something you would have been thinking about. It wouldn't have been on your radar to think through, how do I transition well? How do I handle this properly? Because you were never going to leave.
Because some of the powers that be, some of the church planning networks will say things like, buy your burial plot and live there forever, which Paul would have failed that. He went all over that. And then he got arrested, and then Paul never really stayed in a place. I'm not saying go everywhere and do everything, but I'm just saying let's not put demands on what God is going to do. I never anticipated that God would move me out of this mission field to go somewhere else.
And a lot of times too, when a pastor leaves or goes to another assignment, it seems like in a couple of weeks they're gone.
Which I understand that a little more now.
And I know it's hard to stick around. When you came to kind of determine what that process was going to look like, did you go to Amazon and buy a bunch of books on transitioning well, or did you read?
I went to the Bible. I went to our relationships. I talked to you. We talked through this, and I just kept thinking, what's the very healthiest thing for the church? And it just kept coming back to, it's not about me. It's about the church. How do I send this church off as healthy as I can? What am I doing that could be harmful to the church? What am I doing that could be good for the church? And I just kept that in my perspective the entire time. Now, I'd go home and go, oh, man, this is hard. Yeah. But if I just kept the biblical approach to how do we lead a healthy church.
Yeah.
And then I started making myself less. There's not a lurching.
Sure.
I'm thinking very carefully about the long haul of what's going to happen on the day I'm not here anymore.
Right.
Well, I don't want that to feel like a lurching halt. So almost a month ago, we started winding some things down, raising some things up. And then, of course, the church was going through the process of evaluating you. And now they've gone through that process. Now we know you're doing this. Like I'm just shrinking myself for the good of the church. And I don't know if there's a bunch of books on that. I didn't go looking for them. There might be, there might not be. I don't know.
But I really just want to take a minute and really applaud you in how you determine this process should look. Because you're really at the core of this whole deal. Have really sought Christ in his direction, both in your leaving, both in the next steps for our church here locally, and in the steps of what that transition would look like. And it's funny, too, as we've been having conversations about our heroes of the faith and how they finish their ministries well. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Of just really making more of Christ and less of ourselves.
And I guess I did look to some of those examples. Like what happened here, that was helpful. Some of those really faithful men of history, that was very helpful. Yeah. There's one really pressing question our listeners are probably wondering that we should deal with before we cut the podcast off.
Let's end with that.
What is going to happen with Salty Believer Unscripted? Yep. So the beautiful thing about the world in which we live right now is technology allows us to continue to connect.
Praise God.
So it is our intention to just keep this thing going through Zoom. I think there'll be more perspective as I've moved and I'm seeing things from a different perspective, a different angle, from different community. You're here, and maybe it'll open up the door for some additional guests. We haven't done a lot of guests over time. But the hope is, God willing, we'll just continue this thing and just keep going. But we'll be serving in different capacities because this thing started when I was at a different church before I even planted.
And you started with a guy at that church.
Yeah.
And then you went to a different church.
And that guy's roles have changed.
Right? And you had Brett on here for a while.
It's just kind of what happens. And so I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I want to encourage our listeners, hey, just buckle up and take this journey with us. And let's see what's going to happen.
Absolutely. I think it'll make our podcast better because it'll have different perspectives, different denominations. We might, like you said,
moving into EFCA,
you might bring some of your staff members on and people in your circles, and I might find some new people in my circles that we can bring on, and so I think it'll make it great.
We're just going to keep holding on to that. If this is beneficial for the listener and it's edifying to Christ and it helps the listener, it glorifies Christ and edifies the listener, then we just want to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I say here around the church all the time that God's got the whole thing rigged. So while this transition was a surprise to us, I know it wasn't a surprise to Christ. And I fully believe he's going to do great things through you and your ministry in Nebraska as we both, separately now, seek to see our cities and our communities redeemed by the power of the gospel and continue to help others and equip others for the Christian journey in their life. So,
absolutely.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening. Salty Believer Unscripted is a production of SaltyBeliever.com. Visit the website to find more resources like the podcast you've just listened to.